Hello, and welcome to part 4 of my video series about gospel-based parenting. If you have not done so already, I would highly encourage you to go back and check out part 1, the introduction, part 2, what does the Bible say about spanking, and part 3, what is the biblical rod? Today, we will be answering the question, how should we interpret the book of Proverbs? Since the 4 verses most commonly used to defend the practice of hitting children as a form of discipline are all found in this one book of wisdom literature. As someone who's passionate about languages and linguistics, I have always been fascinated with the study of hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the methodology that we use to interpret texts. It is so important for Christians to learn how to have a proper hermeneutic, because if we cannot accurately interpret Scripture, then we cannot accurately apply Scripture. The first place to start when trying to accurately interpret a text is to ask some basic questions about the book as a whole. Asking questions like who, what, when, where, why, and how will help us to have a better idea of the context that the book was written in. And context is key. The good news for us is that the author of the book of Proverbs actually answers most of these questions in the very first chapter. Let's check it out. The first question that we should be asking is, who wrote the book of Proverbs? And we find the answer to this question in the very first verse. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. This book was written mostly by King Solomon. But for whom was the book of Proverbs written? He tells us the answer to this question in verse 8. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching. So King Solomon wrote these proverbs for his son, who would one day be king of Israel. But why? Why did he write Proverbs? The answer to this question is found in verses 2 through 6. To know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. You see, Proverbs is not a parenting book. While there are definitely applications that we can make to our lives as parents, the purpose of this book was for King Solomon to pass down some wisdom to his son in preparation for him to take over as king once Solomon died. And even that did not turn out too well for him. When King Solomon passed away, his son Rehoboam was supposed to take over the throne, but 10 out of the 12 tribes of Israel rejected him as king because he was terrible. So after Solomon died, the nation of Israel split in two, with Rehoboam being the king of Judah in the south, and his other son, Jeroboam, being the king of Israel in the north. But both of Solomon's sons were terrible rulers, wicked human beings, and utterly godless men. Probably not the kind of men that you would want to take parenting advice from. So let's talk about what Proverbs are and what Proverbs are not. First of all, Proverbs are principles. They are not promises. Proverbs are wise sayings, but they are not guarantees. Yes, Proverbs are memorable advice, but they are not commands from God. Proverbs are usually figurative. They are not usually literal. And finally, Proverbs are generally true, but not necessarily true. Proverbs are not meant to be applicable or true in every situation or for every person. The primary errors that we will run into when we try to interpret the book of Proverbs are if we interpret principles as commands, proverbs as promises, figurative language as literal language, and generalizations as always accurate and absolute truth. And these are precisely the 4 errors that we find when people attempt to use the verses in Proverbs about the rod as an excuse to hit their children. So let's look at some examples to see what would happen if we use the same flawed hermeneutic to interpret other verses in the book of Proverbs. Principles as commands. Put a knife to your throat if you are given to appetite. Proverbs 23:2. Now, I have never heard a pastor preach a sermon on this one, but I can almost guarantee you that none of you are assuming that this is what that verse means. This verse is talking about a principle of overeating, but we should not interpret this passage as a command to cut our throats for having too much to eat at the Sunday barbecue. The second error that we find is when we interpret Proverbs as promises. A hard worker has plenty of food, but a person who chases fantasies has no sense. Proverbs 12:11. As someone who's spent a large portion of my life working with people in third world countries, and also as someone who really enjoys history, I can assure you that some of the hardest working people that I know are often struggling with not having enough food to put on the table. In fact, sometimes they don't even have a table. It would be terribly wrong for us to tell someone that all they have to do is work hard and they will always have plenty of food. This proverb is not a promise. Our third error is when we interpret figurative language as literal language. For example, in Proverbs 4:17, we read, "For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence." Should we assume that this is what King Solomon meant? I don't think so. Since Proverbs falls into the category of wisdom literature, many of the verses that we find in this book are meant to be taken figuratively and not literally. And that is definitely the case with some of the spanking passages. Here's another example of a figurative passage that also mentions the rod. Proverbs 14:3 says, "In the mouth of the foolish is a rod of pride, but the lips of the wise shall preserve them." Or are we to assume that foolish people have a literal rod of pride in their mouths? Of course not. And finally, the fourth error that we encounter is when people interpret generalizations as always accurate and absolute truth. These verses are a clear example of this. Proverbs 26:4 says, "Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself." But verse 5 says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes." So, which is it? I want to reiterate to you that Proverbs is not a parenting book. It is not a how-to manual for disciplining small children, and it was never intended to be one. It is not a guide for godly mothers and fathers for how to raise godly children. While there is wisdom for all ages contained in its pages, it's essential that we can read the book of Proverbs considering the full context of the whole book, which again is not for parents raising small children, but for a grown man preparing to be king. We know this because of the many sections devoted to adult topics like adultery, murder, and drinking, issues that don't really come up with a tantrum-throwing toddler. We must accurately interpret Scripture in order to be able to accurately apply Scripture, especially regarding the topic of spanking, due to its widespread and varied use. Because our obedience to God regarding the discipline of our children will have an impact on generations to come. This concludes part 4 of the Gospel-Based Parenting video series. If you've not done so already, I highly encourage you to go back and check out part 1, the introduction, part 2, what does the Bible say about spanking, part 3, what is the biblical rod, and be sure to like and share this video, which is part 4, how should we interpret the Proverbs? Now that you know how to interpret Proverbs and you know some of the common errors in interpretation that we may face, we are ready to dive deeper into the 4 passages that are used to defend spanking. And the answer to this question left me 100% convinced that there's absolutely no biblical basis for a parent to ever hit their child. The whole argument for spanking, as is practiced in most of the world and in modern-day Christianity, is completely destroyed when we understand the true meaning of the word that is translated as child. As I mentioned before, this video series is based on my book, Gospel-Based Parenting, which is available for purchase on Amazon.com. You can also download a free copy of my book from my website, www.peacefulworldschoolers.com. Every chapter includes a list of reflection and application questions that are meant to inspire discussions between you and your spouse, your small group, or even your church. These discussions are so important and will help you to reflect on your own personal experiences, analyze your own biases or preconceived ideas, and apply biblical truths in a way that will transform your family as you live out the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if you have enjoyed this series so far, please like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you'll be able to continue to receive updates on my latest videos.